So today we're going to be examining pro and anti-natal birth policies. So on this slide, you see the standard we're looking at, which is 2.7, which looks at a lot of various population policies for individual countries. So thinking about why countries enact and what the purpose, the intent, and ultimately the long-term and short-term effects of various population policies enacted by countries are. So you're going to see two terms here that are really important. So I would get those down. And the rest is sort of me talking about a lot of stuff. So pro and anti-natalist birth policies. Those are kind of the important terms from this. So you'll notice in the standard, you also see a little bit about immigration policies. So obviously immigration policies enacted by countries can change the population structure of the countries as well. So we'll talk about that in kind of the little next part of this unit that comes in a week or so. All right, so we'll get into it. Pro and anti-natalist birth policies. So first, I'm going to run through the definition of each and kind of a brief overview of each. And then we're going to look at and talk about some examples of pro-natalist birth policies. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about some examples of anti-natalist birth policies. And then you'll have a reading that goes with anti-natalist birth policies. Okay, so pro-natalist birth policies are defined as policies meant to encourage reproduction. So oftentimes enacted by countries that are seeking to raise the fertility rate within the country. So think about the types of countries that might have these types of policies. They are generally countries that have low fertility rates. So obviously we know that most of those countries would be more developed countries. So in general, you'll see pro-natalist birth policies will be more associated with more developed countries that are, in essence, trying to encourage people within their country to have families or larger families, or trying to stop, in effect, some of the negative economic effects of having fertility rates that are below 2. On the flip side of the coin, anti-natal birth policies are defined as policies that are meant to discourage reproduction, often intended to solve demographic concerns or problems like overpopulation or resource concerns. Okay, so anti-natal birth policies are kind of a big category and mean kind of have a lot of different types of things in them. So for one thing, they include some of the extreme kind of coercive policies like China's one-child policy, which is enacted back in the 1970s, basically mandating to people within the country that they were allowed to have no more than one child. And it's important to note that that wasn't the same for everyone throughout the country, and there were some interesting exceptions and some more nuance to the policy than that. But ultimately, that was the big effect. And then there's some other examples as well. Singapore, Vietnam, some other examples of fairly coercive government-imposed kind of one-child policy-like things. So those are included as anti-natal birth policies because obviously they are meant to discourage reproduction, but also some other ones that are less coercive that center around kind of the introduction or encouraging the use of birth control, family planning, or reproductive health education promotion, essentially. So both of those are considered anti-natalist because they are both meant to discourage reproduction, but obviously kind of different categories of things to think about within that. So we're going to talk about pronatal first. So this is an example. So France is an example of a country that has relative amounts of success with instituting pronatal birth policies because they spend a lot of money and they have a big effort to actually do that. So the current policy within France allows cash payments for women who decide to have a third child, trying to raise the fertility rate beyond kind of that 2.0. Cheaper childcare, free nursery school, paid maternity leave for up to 3 years. So that is more common in that part of the world than it is in our neck of the woods. But paid maternity leave, essentially, maternity leave is kind of paid leave through a government program that allows women, and then paternity leave is for men, to stay home with their children after childbirth. And then a lower kind of a tax rate that incentivizes families, right? Which we have a little bit of that in the United States as well with some child tax credits, but essentially trying to structure taxes in a way that encourage families. So as a result, France has a higher birth rate than much of other parts of Western Europe, and maybe not as an entire result, but kind of partially as a result. France has a higher birth rate. But on the flip side, France also spends a lot of money trying to do all of these things too. So we mentioned maternity leave, and that is probably the thing that you, probably one of the things that you maybe already know a little bit about, but one of the most obvious examples of a pro-natal birth policy. So this is a kind of a map of the worldwide distributions of sort of the generosity of paid maternity leave programs. So you can see, notably, the United States is one of the only kind of major countries in the world that doesn't have some sort of national paid leave program, although some of it is done by state sort of individually. So we see California, New York, Washington, New Jersey all have programs that are paid maternity leave programs sort of by state individually, but most of the country does not. So that's an interesting discussion and something that we'll talk a little bit about in class. Then a few other states starting soon. All right, and here's just a wackadoodle example of a pro-natal birth policy from Russia. Essentially, they have a holiday where everybody gets a day off, and then roughly about 9 weeks later, they have something called Patriot Day, I think it's called, where if you have a child on that day, you can win like free prizes like refrigerators and stuff. So that is one of the zanier pro-natalist birth policies that that I can remember finding. Okay, so on the other side of the coin, we have anti-natalist birth policies. So remember at the beginning, we talked about kind of the wide spectrum of anti-natalist birth policies and sort of what fits into that category. So I have here a poster from, I think, the Senegal, which is a country in Western Africa that is obviously trying to promote family planning within the country. So you can see within that poster, kind of smaller family sizes and encouraged within it. So let's see, we already kind of said this, but range from policies in less developed countries encouraging the use of contraception or adoption of family planning to more extreme and coercive policies enacted by the government. So some examples of that we said were the one-child policy, some of Singapore's population policies, which we'll look at some posters in just a second. And then you can also come up with some policies that were enacted in Vietnam, India, lots of countries. I would say it's kind of an interest. A lot of these policies were enacted in like the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, kind of at the height of population concerns, especially in East and Southeast and South Asia. So a lot of them are having interesting effects in the world right now, which we'll talk about. All right, so this is from Singapore. You can see kind of the very straightforward kind of poster, propaganda poster that they made up. Here's another example. It's kind of interesting to see the difference between, this is from the early days of kind of encouraging people to have smaller families. And then this is trying to encourage people to have families earlier. So somewhat, like we said, somewhat coercive or propaganda-like, but still encouraging people to have sort of a certain type of family. And then the most important population policy, and one that had the most profound effect on the world, is called the one-child policy, which is now the two-child policy, and now really like the very, very, very loosely enforced two-child policy. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this because we were going to read and then watch another video about it. But the one-child policy was introduced in the 1970s and in essence prohibited women from having more than one child. So there were some parts of the country where that wasn't true, especially kind of more agricultural parts of the country in which people might need more than one child to farm. And what we saw within China is that this policy was enforced very, very strictly and very, very harshly by local officials often. So there was a high rate, especially in certain parts of the country, a high level of like monitoring that existed, and fines, enforced sterilizations, abortions were implemented fairly widely as a method of coercing populations or forcing populations to have only one child. So there were tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of effects of this. Some of them attended, which is the kind of what you see in a population pyramid, which is a lowering of the fertility rate kind of to levels that the government wanted it to. And some of them sort of unintended. So as a result, you have millions of Chinese that are essentially living as undocumented citizens within their own country, unable to access benefits or education because they were, in essence, the child that is not registered with the government. You also have lots of girls that were essentially not legal citizens. A lot of girls that were put up for adoption, and a lot of other really kind of negative unintended consequences that we'll read and talk about. So it's important to know that in 2015, this policy was officially changed. So it went from the one-child policy to the two-child policy, and it was loosened again in 2018. So at this point, it's a fairly loose policy, and actually China is kind of having the opposite problem where they are wanting the fertility rate to go up in the country. So this is a very recent stamp from China that came around at the time of the loosening of the one-child policy to the two-child policy. And you can see kind of the message here. And then this is a map of fertility rates within China. So you can see a lot of the country, kind of especially in the northeastern part, but along the coast as well, having really, really low fertility rates. So as we keep going, I'm going to have you read an article about kind of some of the negative effects on women within the country, about kind of the missing girl issue within China, and then we're also going to watch a video on how this has essentially skewed the age structure of the country in ways that is harmful to China in 2020. All right, thanks.